This week, I'm trying something new, not with the pots made, but the way I've filmed parts of this video. I've wanted to add some new angles to my films for a long time, and a friend of mine recently suggested using a GoPro to film footage from my perspective. Although you may already notice that I'm using it sparingly, and there's a few reasons for that. And so, whilst this video shows me wedging up clay and throwing 3 medium-sized bowls, I'll discuss the pros and cons I found from using a GoPro, together with discussing technique, how I make these shapes, and why I do certain things. Let's begin with the obvious pro. It opens up new camera angles that are otherwise very difficult to film, thus, hopefully, shedding some light on what my hands are doing during certain steps, which may be more difficult to see from some of the angles I normally choose. It also provides me with another means of gathering footage without constantly having to get up, wash my hands, and move my tripod and camera to a new spot. I quickly discovered that the GoPro needs a ton of light to film without the footage appearing too grainy, but that leads me to the first con, which is quality. The footage is noticeably more grainy, and I immediately missed the slightly blurred foreground and background my normal lens provides, which makes these videos feel a bit more professional, I think, as compared to, say, if I film these using my phone, where everything is in focus. This means when I splice this footage with the GoPro footage, there's quite a jarring contrast, and I'm still not entirely sure I like it. It may be good for showing certain processes in particular detail, but it certainly won't become the norm for my videos, unless I can find a camera that stabilizes the footage, like this GoPro does, has the low depth of field which I like, and shoots in a much higher quality, but perhaps I'm asking for too much. The GoPro footage also made me feel surprisingly nauseous when editing this video together, so I think in the future, unless you guys love it, I'll be saving the GoPro footage for very particular moments, as compared to showing the entire throwing and trimming process via the GoFlow perspective. Ultimately, I've always tried to make my videos feel as if they're the same quality as my photographs, and I just worry if perhaps the GoPro is just one step back in terms of quality, even if it does open up a whole new view on making pots. Anyway, do let me know what you think, or if you have any suggestions or advice, I'd love to read it, as I'm still relatively new to the filmmaking world. I've been making a lot of bowls recently, but I've been missing a slightly larger, medium-sized vessel, and I thought it best throwing a simple form whilst getting used to having a camera strapped to my head. I was using very soft clay, yet I don't throw these on a bat, which is an additional platform you can attach to the wheel head, so the pots you throw on it don't have to be manhandled when removed from the wheel, rather you just lift the bat and the pot comes along with it. Yet, I don't use that method for most of the bowls I make. Instead, I just leave enough clay in the base into which I compress 4 of my fingertips to carefully pry the bowl away. With these bowls, I began by throwing the walls taller than necessary, and then I gradually begin to push the walls down, throwing them initially, stretching out the clay and making the form more curvaceous. Whenever I alter the walls with my hands, I make sure the surface of the walls of the pot are wet. Otherwise, skin quickly sticks to dry clay, and as soon as it does, it can drag a portion of the pot off center, creating a wobble or a slight undulation in the rim. Consistency is vital, and you can often see that in the throwing rings in the pot. If they're consistently spaced and even as they traverse the walls of the bowl or whatever pot you're making, then it means you're pulling properly and evenly. Although there are of course times where you do need to alter your pressure, or the speed at which you move your fingers, and often that's the case when throwing things like bottles and vases, when certain parts of the pot suddenly constrict, such as around the narrow neck and rim of a bottle shape. But for forms like this, bowls, they should look fairly consistent. For the final bit of shaping, I use a curved metal kidney and push it down into the soft clay, peeling back the soft layer of slip, revealing slightly firmer clay beneath, wiping away the excess from the tool as I go, which, albeit a simple process, is one I urge you to take care doing, as wiping away clay off the edge of these metal kidneys is easily the way I've cut myself the most when making pottery. I then scrape away much of the slip on the outside, and I do the same around the base, as I want to create a relatively dry area from which I'll be able to pick the pot off the wheel from. If I left it covered in slip, that wet clay would stick to my fingertips as I tried to lift the pot away, so instead I always lift from a dry area with dry hands, so neither hand or pot stick to one another. I then rolled the rim over slightly, so that it comes to a fine point on the inside of the wall, as opposed to the outside. This should mean that once fired, the form should feel more enclosed without actually being so, instead of the rim flaring out slightly, which makes the pot feel as if it's offering out its contents, as compared to enclosing them. Lastly, I chamois the rim, just to soften it slightly, so it doesn't conclude at a harsh, sharp angle. And then a twisted wire is slid underneath, and then I can use 4 fingertips pressed into the base as if each one is touching the point of a square, which means the pressure applied is distributed evenly, which keeps the pot from distorting as it's moved. It's also paramount that both hands are kept completely level as you move the bowl from wheel to board, as if one hand raises higher or lower than the other, there's a fairly good chance that the rim will bow or warp slightly. And you can see the impressions my fingers leave in the base, which is one of the reasons I throw these with enough clay in the bottoms to account for this slight deformation, although you can always plug these holes back up with clay at the end of the day once the bowls have firmed up a bit. As I've already wedged this clay, I'll just spend a few moments patting it into more or less the right shape I want for throwing, which is a piece of clay with a rounded base, so when slammed against the wheelhead, it doesn't trap any air beneath it. I then immediately push the lower parts of my hands around the base, sealing the lump of clay to the wheel, and then I cone the soft lump of clay up and down a few times, which is sort of like wedging on the wheel, whilst at the same time it aligns all the particles, making the clay more plastic and easier to throw with. At least that's the idea anyway. And as this clay is so soft, it's very easy to manipulate, although that does equally mean the clay will lose its strength more quickly as it's saturated with water, which means if the walls overhang too much and they're too wet, there's a good chance the form could slump or the walls flop over. So while soft clay does make the centering, the opening and the pulling up of the walls easier, generally it means you need to be more careful when shaping and lifting the pot away from the wheel. With this amount of clay, I never try to gain too much height with my first pull, and even before lifting up the walls, I'll compress the clay and make sure the rim at this stage is as wobble free as possible, as occasionally when opening the shape up, that's a point when some unevenness can be introduced into the walls of the vessel. You may also notice that for a number of these pulls, I use a soaked sponge clasped in my hand on the outside. I do this not only because it keeps the outside wall hydrated with water as I pull, but it also helps me apply pressure with a larger point of contact, as compared to just using my knuckle or using the heel of my left hand, which is another way of throwing thicker expanses of clay at the start, and one I should maybe make a video about in the future, as I don't see it practiced very often. But I just push the soaked sponge into the base, compressing as much of that clay in slightly, forcing it into that upper section of the wall, and then gradually and very evenly pulling it up towards the rim, maintaining the same pressure with all my fingers that I applied at the beginning of the pull right through to the end. And then I very gently release my grip as I reach the top, instead of pinching through the rim, which I often see beginners do, which immediately creates an undulation in the rim and an unevenness as there'll be a thin spot where you squeeze through it. As I push down on the walls with the kidney, I always place my other hand opposite where I'm working, bracing the walls, whilst at the same time also pushing in against the metal edge. I don't always scrape away the slip on the outside, especially with my smaller bowls, but that's more because I can't easily fit a tool in between the metal wheel head and the curve of the wall, whereas on this size I easily can, and doing so will help the outer wall dry out a bit faster. Any scraps I remove from the tool or from my hands immediately go into the reclaim bucket to my left, as opposed to having it somewhere else in the studio. This makes cleanup relatively easy, and when my wheel tray is full of turnings, I can simply dump them over the side and directly into the bucket. It also means that scraps, like these, don't just fill up my wheel tray as I'm making. Instead, it's just the watery slip that accumulates throughout the day, and then I just use the sponge to direct the clay to the hole you can see in the wheel tray, which leads into a hose that goes into the reclaim bucket, which all in all makes cleanup relatively easy, which is a nice thing when it ends up being something you do almost every day. I had one last chunk of clay to use, and as it had been sitting out for a while, I gave it a quick wedge, just to make sure the texture was completely even throughout, as my tabletop is really quite porous, and if I leave clay resting on the wood, it can quickly remove quite a lot of moisture from the part that's making contact. It's then centered, the base is sealed so it doesn't fly off, and then the coning up and down can begin. And what I try to watch as I do this is the top of the lump of clay. If I cone it up and the top of the piece of clay is undulating from side to side dramatically, then I know the piece isn't ready to be thrown into a pot. So instead I repeat this process until the top of the lump of clay is spinning perfectly centered. At least that's what I tell myself. I'm sure most of the time it isn't. But when I am throwing anything other than the mugs and bowls which I've made tens of thousands of, then I do tend to concentrate perhaps a little bit more with the coning and the centering of the lump of clay. Before opening it up, I usually squash it down with my fist, and then I use my thumb and index finger to push into the middle to create the hollow of the bowl. As I want to trim tall feet on these, I'm purposefully leaving about 2 centimeters or about an inch in the base. And I don't open up the hollow to be flat. Instead, I immediately begin throwing it to have a curve, even from this beginning point. I force the sponge in, not too far, as I don't want to make the base so narrow, as it's the base of the bowl at this point, which actually ends up supporting the overhanging walls. So if you are making bowls, and you're finding that the walls are suddenly collapsing, it may be because you're pushing in at the base too much, removing clay that would otherwise support the walls. The process then continues as normal, with the walls being pulled up and out and gradually shaped. I try to never rush this process, as harsh, quick movements on overhanging walls tends to be a quick way of causing a disturbance in the walls, meaning that one side might flop down further than the other, creating an undulation that's difficult to correct, especially with soft clay that's been stretched out like this. When I'm making my small medium bowls, if they do slump too far down, I simply scrap them and move on to the next, as it's usually quicker to do that than salvage one that's too far gone. And with the base undercut, the rim chamoised, which the GoPro view shows nicely, I think, as it's draped over the rim, really, and then compressed, rather than being aggressively forced over it, which you'll find will distort the pot you're making. I then wire through, and then stuff 4 fingers into those 4 corners, and lift at the exact same moment I spin the wheel. A quick batch of bowls, really, with rims once trimmed that should interact nicely with the glazes, and an easy form to make whilst having a camera attached to my head. Do let me know what you think about the GoPro footage, even though I have probably already made up my mind, but maybe I'm missing something, or perhaps there's a camera that's better suited for this task. Either way, I hope it sheds some light on the throwing process. I think I'll be using it sparingly, and with much better light. Anyway, until next time, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week. Hopefully, as my main camera's off being repaired, as I somehow ripped the threads out of it, meaning I can't attach it to my tripod. Anyway, enough moaning, and back to my normal cleaning up outro.